book.
This is what I was telling you. It's called The Dutch Boy Conquers Old Man Gloom.
So this coloring book was published by the National Lead Company in 1929. And on the cover is Dutch Boy. He's holding hands with these two little kids. And the whole coloring book has this story in it. These kids, they live in this really drab, really dingy apartment or house.
No paint on the walls.
No paint on the walls. It's really gray. And that home is personified by this character, Old Man Gloom.
He's dressed in old, black, 19th century clothes. He has a big top hat. He has a long, ugly beard. He's using a cane.
And lo and behold, as you turn the page, Dutch Boy comes along, and he's carrying a can of paint, and he's very colorful. Like he could be straight out of a Disney movie.
The children say, "Oh, could you invite him in? He looks like such a fun guy. Maybe he'll make our gloomy life a little happier." And he comes in and he teaches the kids how to paint their room, paint their furniture, their toys, their walls, everything. He shows how much fun it'll be. For feeling blue, you're not to blame. Come, let me show you a new game. This famous Dutch boy lead of mine can make this playroom fairly shine. And suddenly this room, which was this kind of dingy greenish gray, becomes this bright playroom where everything shines. And Old Man Gloom says, "I've been undone by Dutch boy paint and Dutch boy lead."
Inside was a little coupon for a can of lead paint that read, "Give coupon to mom or dad."
Yeah, everybody thinks the tobacco industry invented all this stuff. Lead industry was putting out these ads aimed at children, at youth. They had their version of Joe Camel, well before Joe Camel was invented.
This Joe Camel strategy worked. Dutch Boy would appear at parades and in newspaper ads extolling the benefits of lead, and people were convinced it was safe. In the period leading up to this coloring book, the lead paint industry was booming, pumping out around 160,000 tons of lead at its peak. And not just Dutch Boy. Lead was cheap and it was plentiful. Sherwin-Williams made lead paint, Benjamin Moore. And the real upside was that lead is opaque. The lead that went into paint was a fine white powder that created a solid, durable surface. It just had to be mixed with a little linseed oil.
Each gallon of lead paint had about 16 pounds of lead in it. Half the container was lead.
But because lead went in as a powder, it also comes off as an invisible dust that can cover pretty much everything. Floors, windowsills, children's toys. This is not just about kids who eat paint. Lead dust enters the bloodstream very easily.
Children were coming down with seizures and going into comas and dying because they were touching these walls, getting stuff on their hands, and then putting their hands in their mouth.
It was also in this era that companies such as General Motors and Standard Oil began adding lead to gasoline to improve engine performance.
And that's why ethyl gasoline brings out the full power and performance of your car. So next time you buy
And this introduced large quantities of lead to the air that everyone was breathing. And according to the internal documents Rosner's pieced together, people in the lead industry knew exactly what kind of effects all of this was having on people's health. And they got away with it, he says, by going after the science. They went after pediatricians and researchers who were raising the alarm. They threatened them with lawsuits. But as the evidence mounted, as more and more kids were poisoned, the Lead Industry Association took another tack. They passed this off as a problem that only affected people of color.
They say this in their memos. The only people who are really victimized by it are Puerto Rican and Negro people. And we can't do anything about that unless we really rebuild the housing. Ho-ho, that's not going to happen. Or alternatively, and they say this, educate their parents not to let them eat lead. And how does one accomplish that task, they say? How can we ever educate them? This was an indication of the racism of the culture.
I mean, this street right here was one of the most populated streets in East Harlem.
In New York City, Carlito Rivera witnessed that racism firsthand. In 1969, at just 15 years old, he joined the Young Lords, a Latino grassroots political organization. And at a time when few public officials were willing to take on this problem, groups like the Young Lords and the Black Panther Party, they began knocking on doors with a team of medical students, testing kids in their neighborhoods.
And we would have literature ready to explain that we're testing because basically because this system is trying to kill you.
Rivera remembers one child in particular, a little boy in a Puerto Rican family with very high lead levels.
The kid resided on this block. And if I'm not mistaken, he lived in this building right there.
Describe what he was like, though.
He was wobbly. He had this fainted look. And we were concerned.
A couple days later, Rivera and a couple of other members came to take him to the hospital.
And one of the medical students put on a suit, and it was to set an impression to the people at the emergency room. And you had to do that in those days because basically they didn't give a shit about poor people coming in and telling them that they were discovered to have some kind of poisoning.
And you didn't think that he would get the proper treatment if you took him to the hospital?
No, we went there. They knew who the young lawyers were. All the institutions were a little bit apprehensive about stepping on our toes because we were young and we were stupid and crazy. So I got to tell you how we were. We were, defiant. And they didn't know how to deal with us.
They were actually acting as first responders.
Yeah, but even this late in the game, the way that everyone thought about lead was very, very different from the way that we do now. People still thought of it as something that really only caused harm at high levels. But then someone came along who would fundamentally change the way we think about what lead does to young, developing brains.
I was a practicing pediatrician. I made house calls.
This is Dr. Herbert Needleman.
And in my training at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, I treated my first case of lead poisoning, a very sick little Hispanic girl.
Needleman passed away in 2017, but he spoke about this case in an interview years ago that shows his way of thinking. This kid was living in a house.
Strange incidents during this time because we were offering the children money for their teeth.
Irving Shapiro was a colleague of Needleman's at the time. He's an expert on tooth formation. Needleman was offering a silver dollar for each tooth.
And I remember one day a guy appeared in my lab, a very fierce-looking individual, and he said, "I want money." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "I brought you the teeth." And he had a handful of bloody teeth in his hand, and he wanted money for each of those teeth that he brought in. And I gave him the money. He scared me silly.
And did they use those teeth?
No, they didn't. But in a few years' time, they did manage to examine 760 teeth from first graders in Philadelphia. And of course, what they found, black students had much higher levels than white students. That's what you would expect, given everything I've just described. But what was more surprising, and Shapiro says this, was that almost all of these kids, whether they were white or black, suburban or urban, most of them had been exposed to what at the time even were considered very, very high levels of lead from the time they were babies. And this shocked a lot of people.
What we discovered affected so many children. We were not talking about a few children. We were talking about a large number of children. And when you play that out across the country, the number of kids who are involved was sufficient to make people wake up, make the health authorities wake up to the fact that there was this devastating event that was taking place in our cities. In fact, no children were unaffected by it because lead was ubiquitous.
Now that they know it's ubiquitous, meaning now that they know that there's white kids being affected.
Exactly. And as Needleman kept pursuing this question, he later went on to Harvard where he continued this research. He found that this exposure, even at levels that were considered minuscule at the time, was causing real damage.
And we came to the conclusion that lead was a poison and there was no safe level of lead at all in the human body.
So what effect did this research have?
Well, lead paint was banned in 1978. It was also in the 1970s that the U.S. began phasing lead out of gasoline. And it wasn't all due to Needleman, but certainly many of the people I've interviewed told me his research was essential in pushing those policies forward.
So he won.
Average lead levels in the United States have dropped more than 90% since the 1970s. But as we know from those 4 little kids I told you about earlier, that doesn't include everyone.
Coming up, how we missed our chance to solve this problem for good.
WNYC Studios is supported by NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. When was the last time you paused to dream big? No, not big like your favorite team making the playoffs. Like really big. That's where NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast comes in. Whatever you're dreaming of, NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast has the financial advice you need to finally get there. Get ahead and stay ahead of your finances with weekly nerdy wisdom from money experts Sean Piles and Liz Weston. Find NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast wherever you listen to your favorite shows.
Hey, there's a bunch of really great stuff here to suck on.
What?
On Radiolab, we're going up.
These trees are huge.
Into the treetops.
It was like being a detective.
To chase a mystery.
There's something going on up here.
What's about to happen?
Oh my gosh!
And stumble into a secret garden.
This is amazing.
I know.
Whoa.
In the sky. Forests on Forests. Listen wherever you get podcasts.
New on The Experiment. Across the country, people are transforming what it means to work. And this isn't the first time. Back in the 1980s, Minnesota meatpackers began one of the longest and most bitter labor strikes in American history, redefining how many of us think about labor. SPAM, How the American Dream Got Canned, is a 3-part series about food, work, and family on The Experiment from the Atlantic and WNYC studios. Listen wherever you get podcasts.
You know, Kai,
Yeah.
we went back to that mother and her kids who are dealing with all this lead paint.
Go in your bed. Go in your bed. You too, madam.
You know, the landlord was supposed to have taken care of this problem within 5 days.
Right.
And I assumed that this problem was over and done with. But over 2 months since I first walked through her door, nothing has been done.
Yeah, but, my kids is still picking the paint off the wall and stuff.
They're still doing it?
Yeah, they're still eating it.
Oh, God.
I don't know what else to do. It's frustrating.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
And you can't keep them away from it.
Exactly, because it's in their room. So, you know what I'm saying? You sleeping at night, you don't know what they're doing in here. So, it's like, you wake up in the morning, you see paint all over the floor. Like, wait, y'all was eating the paint? Yes, mommy. Why? I don't know.
And listening to her, Christopher, what is striking is that here is a family that turned to the city, to the government, looking for safety. And we have failed her repeatedly. We put her in a facility, in a house that had poison on the wall, and the poison is still there.
Yes, but this is how we've set this system up. I mean, we've essentially made a decision to use kids as canaries. And it's estimated there are over 1 million of them in this country. And we wait until they're shown to have an elevated lead level. And then, only then, do we decide to do anything about it. And I think we need to ask ourselves, are we really okay with that? After he proved in the 1970s that lead was causing all this harm, almost immediately, Herbert Needleman started pushing public officials to take a more preventative approach. I mean, he really thought we could eradicate this for good.
I'd like to now call forward to testify Dr. Herbert L. Needleman, professor of psychiatry.
In 1991, he testified before a House committee hearing pushing this idea that if we were willing to spend the money, we could solve 2 problems. 1, we could go in all these old homes and remove the lead paint. And 2, create jobs by training people in these neighborhoods to do that work.
If you map where lead is piled up in superabundance, and if you map where decent housing is in short supply, and if you map where jobs are in short supply, the 3 maps are virtually identical.
But this was an era of small government, and in the end, he couldn't get it through. Needleman's vision was never realized.
And so that's it? We're just screwed? That's where we're at?
Well, actually, I think we're at a very important moment in this history right now, because there's this different approach that seems to be gaining at least some traction.
Are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
This is Fidelma Fitzpatrick. She's a lawyer at Motley Rice, which is a firm that was involved in a lot of the big cases against the tobacco industry and the asbestos industry. And they've been going after the companies that created this problem in the first place.
It is mind-boggling to me, mind-boggling, that companies could look at the legacy of what they have done and not feel any twinge of corporate responsibility, not believe that they have to be good corporate citizens to solely become part of the solution. They don't want to solve the lead poisoning crisis that exists in America. They don't care about it. And so that's where the law steps in.
In California, 10 cities and counties got together and sued several paint companies, including Sherwin-Williams and the National Lead Company, which is now called NL Industries.
Several local counties will be getting a huge payout after a landmark court decision today, which involves lead paint.
A California judge ruled Sherwin-Williams Company, NL Industries, and ConAgra Grocery Products knew lead paint was dangerous.
And in building this case, Fitzpatrick used all of those historical documents that David Rosner has collected as proof that these companies really knew that they were selling dangerous products all along. I mean, it took 18 years, but in the fall of 2018, the lead paint companies were forced to pay $400 million, which will be used to fund lead abatement programs.
And that's really what the California case was about, forcing accountability on companies that should have taken that mantle up voluntarily, but chose not to.
Christopher, I don't know if that's exciting or it's depressing that we can't count on our government to help families like the one you met.
Right. I mean, not without a willingness to pay for it. And, given that local governments already spend a lot of money dealing with lead paint, I mean, testing kids, inspecting homes, Fitzpatrick says cities all over the country really should be thinking about how to make these paint companies pay their share.
Only then can we actually move forward. The Stakes is a production of WNYC Studios and the newsroom of WNYC. This episode was reported by Christopher Worth. It was edited by Karen Frillman, who is also our executive producer. Casey Means is our technical director. Jim Schachter is vice president for news at WNYC. And the Stakes team also includes
Amanda Aronchik,
Christopher Johnson,
Johnny McCone,
Jessica Miller, Kari Pitkin,
and Verilyn Williams.
With help from
Hannes Brown, Jonathan Cabral,
Michelle Harris,
and all of you. Join us by signing up for our newsletter at thestakespodcast.org. You'll get all kinds of cool stuff like bonus content and musings from me, but maybe most importantly, a chance to tell us about yourselves and help us find some stories. You can also hit me up on Twitter at Kai_Wright and chime in with the hashtag #TheStakes. Thanks for listening.
Support for WNYC reporting on lead is provided by the New York State Health Foundation, improving the health of all New Yorkers, especially the most vulnerable. Additional support for WNYC's health coverage is provided by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Jane and Gerald Katcher and the Katcher Family Foundation, and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation.
This week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, we're asking the question, is cancel culture real?
There used to be this conceit a few years ago, they're going to take your guns away, they're coming to take your guns, and now it's, they're going to take your jokes away, they're going to take your comedians.
That's the New Yorker Radio Hour from WNYC Studios. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.